So in this video, we're going to take a quick, brief look here at 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15. So this is a controversial verse and also quite a confusing verse in the way in which it is set up. So you can see here how I've laid it out that she will be saved. There the Greek word is provided as well. However, by the giving of birth, again, and I provide the Greek, if they remain in faith and love and holiness with self-control. So this is all coming after the instructions about women, learning in quietness and not being given authority to teach men and what that means within that context, and also about it wasn't Adam who was deceived, but Eve, and making the point as well that the words for deceptions are one is more intensive with the Eve, and how that might be playing with the understanding of the Genesis story that it was the serpent who deceives Eve, because Eve may not have been present when the instructions to Adam not to eat from the tree was given, and assuming that Adam was the one who would have taught Eve, but Eve now is teaching Adam that it is okay or good to eat from the tree because of what she heard from the deceiver. So the whole context is about false teachers and potentially false teachers who are preying upon women within the congregation and deceiving them, and these women who have been deceived are assuming or taking authority to teach within the assembly, and this section is trying to resist those activities. But while they are not allowed to assume the authority to teach over men, because maybe they're thinking that they've been deceived, it states that she will be saved. Now, the she, thinking here about who? Is the she Eve, because you just talked about Eve? Is the she the Christian woman who will be saved, who's been deceived by the false teachers? Is the she represented for all women? So it's a little bit unclear who the she is. It's also unclear in what sense we're talking about being saved. Is it a physical salvation? Is it a eschatological salvation we're talking about? And then we have the unusual expression about the giving of birth, or on account of the, birthing of a child. So this sounds very unusual, especially if you consider the idea of saved somehow is connected with this activity of giving birth, which would, certainly contradict all other concepts of salvation that are talked about within the New Testament, that somehow or another you're thinking about salvation in regards to procreation. And then we have the change from the singular she to the plural they. And then who are the they? Now are we talking about they, meaning all women? Or if you've got, the fact that you just talked about giving birth and birth to children, is the they now the children? And is the woman's being saved somehow or another connected to these children remaining in faith and love and holiness? And this holiness is done with self-control. So, it's a very unusual verse that really requires a lot of different types of unpacking. So I'll just point out here that there's been about 6 different interpretations, and probably even more than that, but here are 6 interpretations that I have seen being espoused by different scholars, positions that they have taken to explain it. Well, some will talk about the women is saved by the birth of Jesus. And so saved of the birth of a child has in mind particularly the birth of Jesus. And so the idea that not so much salvation is based on Jesus' birth, but the fact that Jesus was born, lived his life, ended up, being executed and then raised. So this phrase, birth of Jesus, is alluding, as it were, to the whole life of Jesus, and that one is saved because of the whole life of Jesus, which again is at somewhat at odds when a lot of the thought about salvation that we find in the New Testament has to do focus on the salvation that's brought about because of the death of Jesus and consequently his resurrection. Some have thought, well, this saved is really not about some kind of eschatological salvation, but being saved from the pain of childbirth. And so it's in by the childbirth or through the childbirth, she will be saved from some pain of it. That seems kind of an odd interpretation because, what would likely be the experience of most Christian women is that when they are giving birth, there's going to be pain associated with that. And it seems rather an odd promise to be making that women, though they are deceived by false teachers, they can be saved from the pain of childbirth. Just seems like a rather big stretch in terms of thinking about that verse. Now, some will say will not die in childbirth. Now, this does make some historical sense in that the giving birth in the ancient world was a very dangerous time, and many women did die in childbirth. So that's a very real possibility of something that can happen. But again, here's the promise that if you're going to be saved by childbirth or saved through childbirth, what do you do then when you have women who die in childbirth? Is this teaching then saying, well, the reason they died is because they were being punished? But it seems like a promise that, or an indication of how God would work in a woman's life, Christian woman's life, that experience probably would not hold up to be true. Some says in saved despite the pain of childbirth, so that yes, while they will have that child go through that experience of having a child, and that there will be pain that is associated, despite all the pain, she will nevertheless be saved in it, saved despite the fact that she's still experiencing that curse that comes because of Eve. So Eve was mentioned. Part of the curse of Eve was that there would be pain in childbirth. And so here are Christian women who I guess have saved, and some may be thinking that they some kind of eschatological salvation, which might have included being freed from the curse that went to women because of Eve. And here the promise is even though you are still experiencing the pain of childbirth, you still experience the curse, you will be saved despite that. So again, what's the point of the statement? Some have argued that the woman is delivered from Satan by devotion to family responsibility. So this may not be eschatological salvation. It's not about the physical salvation from childbirth. It is delivered or saved from what Satan can do. So again, when you have the story of Eve that is referred in the earlier verse, and we know that there's the idea of a serpent who deceives. Of course, Satan is understood as a deceiver. I'm not saying here that Paul equated the serpent with Satan, but did understand Satan as a deceiver. And this woman can be delivered from Satan and what Satan can do if she was devoted to her family responsibility, that is, being a mother or taking care of children, raising her children. If she will do that, as opposed to maybe what some of the false teachers are saying, is to abandon those roles. that she could be delivered from the deception of Satan, or maybe even delivered from something that Satan can do in her life. So maybe the idea of Satan sometime bringing on certain kind of physical suffering. So it's not so much about eschatological salvation, but it is about delivering from the present role or activity of Satan. And then finally, the last interpretation is can be saved by adhering to her ordained role. So her ordained role, in other words, that God wants women to be mothers, or God wants women to, be responsible for their family and raising their children. And the they can either be for the children, or the they can be for the women who continue in certain characteristics that should be becoming of Christian women. So I say to also look here at 1 Timothy 4:16, because there Paul talks about Timothy saving himself by things that he does. So again, it's not so much that here in 1 Timothy we're seeing salvation that is brought on by the behavior that a person does, but salvation is understood as occurring in the lives of those who behave in a certain way. They're not saved by it, but they're saved in light of recognizing the implications of the gospel and living accordingly. They're not being saved by means of that, but they are being saved in light of the fact that they are accepting the truth of the gospel and living in accordance with it. Of course, the salvation is brought on by Jesus, but that salvation is provided to those who live in a certain way. So we have 6 different types of interpretations. If someone was pressing me, which one do I think makes the most sense? I think number 6 does. That the Paul, and in this particular instance, is dealing with false teachers and the consequences of the false teachers who may have been kind of latching on as well to certain women, maybe particularly either wealthy women or women who are widows. That's why we have the 1 Timothy 5 section that will be coming up later on. And that part of this teaching may have been to reject, as it were, conventional or traditional roles, that they no longer had to give themselves, as it were, to their husbands or to domestic responsibilities, that because they were saved, because they are these new people, all these other areas that tend to bind them, um, they are freed from, and they can now live kind of independent. So the reaction here is against that particular type of doctrine and the result of that doctrine in the lives of Christian women. All right, so that gives us a quick kind of rundown of 1 Timothy 2, verse 15, and some of the different approaches that have been articulated.